So I've been asked by friends and colleagues alike about my workflow for editing the digital pictures that I take with my iPhone. So I thought I'd take a few minutes and show you that workflow. I'm going to start by opening up my favorite app for image processing, and that is Snapseed. And I'm going to tap on Open Photo, and I'm going to open from Device. And it's going to ask me what I want to open. I'm going to start with this picture that I took in an airplane probably early to mid-November, flying back in over Lake Erie back into Cleveland, my hometown. And I thought it was just a beautiful picture. I loved the shadows on the lake and, just the clouds and the blue sky, just the clarity of downtown Cleveland, a beautiful city. And I'm going to tap on Use in Snapseed. And that gives me this photo. And my workflow is pretty standard. The way that Snapseed works, in the lower right corner, you'll see the pencil icon. And if I'm using a picture that has clouds in it, I will traditionally start with the drama filter. So I'll just tap on that. And Snapseed can be real heavy-handed. In fact, some of my stuff, when I've gone back and looked at my older stuff in Snapseed, it appears to be a little too heavy-handed. So I like to go with a little more subtle. So I'm going to, in this case, choose Drama 2 at the bottom. Just tapping on that. Now that's still a little too strong, but you can see that it really accentuates the clouds, adds some contrast to your clouds, adds some contrast to the shadows, but contrast overall. So if I put my finger on the screen, it's going to give me the ability to adjust the filter strength. So I put my finger and lift up or slide up or down. Right now the filter strength is at 90, so I select that and I'm just going to crank that down. And just usually around 35 or so. Depends though. I might leave this one around 40-ish. That looks pretty good right there. And if I put my finger down and slide up, that also takes me to saturation. So you can see that right now saturation is at -40. Down at the very bottom, you'll see that value down there as well. I'm going to turn the saturation back up closer to 0. That looks pretty good right there. So again, it doesn't look that dramatic, but I'm going to go ahead and lock in those changes by tapping the checkbox or the check mark in the lower right corner. And if I hold down my finger on the picture itself, it shows me the original version. And if I let go, that's the edited version. I'm going to go back to the pencil icon in the lower right corner. Now I'm going to tap on HDRscape. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. And what it does is it gives you a much better distribution of tone. In other words, some detail in the white, some detail in the black, but it also tends to kind of mute the contrast and make things kind of muddy. So I'm going to show you how to kind of get around some of that. So I'm going to tap on, even though this is more nature, there's people, which I kind of prefer that filter. There's fine, which I don't know, it's maybe a little painterly. So if you're trying to go for that approach, feel free. And strong, which not too bad here, but it's kind of a dreamlike quality. I'm going to go back to people because that's probably the least intense of all 4 filters. And again, I'm going to put my finger and slide up or down on that image. That's going to give me my options. So I'm going to start with filter strength and I'm going to bring that way back. What I've noticed is if you go with too high of a filter strength, you get some artifacting. And you can see that in the cloud areas, between clouds up towards the top of the picture. You get some weird shadows, things like that. In addition, sometimes you get some ghosting or haloing effects in an HDR. So I'm going to bring this way back. I'm going to come down to about, probably about 20. It looks pretty good right there. And again, this is nothing dramatic. I'm going to look at brightness. I might tone that down ever so slightly, which is also going to help with the contrast. Saturation, I'm going to leave that alone. It looks saturated enough, and if it oversaturated, it just looks too fake. Some of my photographer friends would probably look at this and say it's already too fake, and that's okay. This is what I like. I try and create things that look good or the way I imagined it as I saw it. So I check that off, and that locks in my change. And again, if I hold down on the image, that's my original, and I release, that's the updated version. So you can see already, like the clouds on the water, the shadows, those are a little more stark and visible. A little more detail in the clouds. And I think even downtown Cleveland, the skyscrapers pop a little bit more. And I kind of like the watercolor better in this second one. I'm going to go back to the pencil one more time. Now, maybe not one more time, but tune images is my next step. And again, this is kind of a standard workflow for me. This is what I normally do with my images. And a lot of the changes I think are initially pretty subtle. So I'm going to go to Ambiance and just increase that ever so slightly. Now you could go overkill again with some of these, and you can also go the opposite direction. But in this case, I'm just going to add just a little bit of ambiance. That usually opens up some shadow areas and adds a little bit of warmth. I'm going to go down. These are all my options, so brightness, ambiance, contrast, saturation, shadows, highlights, and warmth. I can add a little bit of warmth to that. I kind of like that right there, even though it was a fall day. A little bit of warmth is good. I like what that does for the watercolor in this image too. Highlights will let me either decrease the brightness, and you can see that happening in the clouds, or if I go the opposite direction, that increases the brightness. So I might add a little bit just to kind of boost that contrast and the whites up a little bit. And then shadows, same thing. If I increase shadows, that adds detail to the shadows. But again, that affects contrast. And if I go the opposite direction, it's going to make them darker and blacker, which that's too much. So I'm going to go back up to I'm going to leave that at 0. Let's see. Contrast. So I might kick the contrast up ever so slightly. And that seems to work pretty good. That helps me recover a little bit from some of the HDR things that I've done to it. And then finally, under brightness, I'm just going to tone that down a little bit. Again, some minor changes. Hit the check mark button. That looks pretty good. Again, putting my finger on the image, there's my original. There's my updated version. So even though I've made some small subtle changes, the net impact is pretty large. I'm going to go back to the pencil, and this time I'm going to add a vignette filter. And vignette is really just going to make the edges darker. Having studied photography in college and spent a significant amount of time in the darkroom, photographers, when we were doing enlargements with chemicals and paper, would often do what we call burning in the edges of the image. In other words, we'd subject them to a little bit more exposure to make them darker, which draws your eye into the center of the image. Here's the vignette, the center of it. I can reposition that anywhere, and you can see as I move that around, outside the circle gets darker, what's in the circle stays larger. I can also put my fingers on the edges of that circle and make it wider or smaller, like so. And not only that, but again, if I put my finger on the image and slide up or down, I can control the outer brightness, so the outer brightness can get much, much darker. Obviously, that's overkill. So let's see here. I could also make it really bright, but I really want to add a little bit of burn to those outside corners, or vignetting. I'm going to reposition this. And I can also, with the inner brightness, make that inner part of the circle brighter or darker, depending. So I'm just going to leave that at neutral or close to it. And I like that. I think I'm going to check mark that, lock in those changes. That's pretty good. Again, tapping the hold down, there's my original. There's my updated version. Pretty good. And what I might do now is I'm considering making this a black and white image. But before I do, I really want to make sure I save this color image. And this is one weakness of Snapseed, is the save feature. If you tap on save and you do save or save a copy, I've had problems where the image tends to disappear. I'm not sure if it's getting saved to a stream or to Google or what happens, because Google owns Snapseed. What I found though is if I tap on export it makes a copy of the image and saves it to my camera roll. So that's ultimately where I want it to be. So that's good. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back to the edit or pencil icon. And now back down to filters, there's a black and white option there. So I'm going to tap on that. That looks pretty good. I can choose different variations of black and white contrast. That contrast looks pretty good right there, but I'm going to play around with some other options. There's a bright, dark, film. I'm going to go to neutral. And down at the very bottom, just underneath that row of options, you'll see 0 and brightness. I've got some other options there. To the left of brightness is a circle with filters. And if you've ever played with black and white photography, different filters will have different effects by filtering out that particular color. So for example, here's red, and that adds a little bit of, makes the sky almost look black towards the top. So those darker blues end up looking black. Orange does a lot of the same, maybe even more severe. Yellow. And you can also see the changes in the whites and the grays as you apply those different filters. So it's up to you to decide what you like. Green looks pretty good actually, although I think I like the red a little bit more. So I'm going to stick with red. Again, putting my finger on the image, scrolling up and down, I can play with brightness. So now that that red has really made this go darker, I can brighten the image up maybe just a little bit. I kind of like that there. Contrast, I can increase it, which might be overkill, or I can decrease it ever so slightly. I think I'm going to leave it just a little higher. And grain. So grain refers to the silver crystals that were traditionally on film. That's those silver crystals degraded from light, and that's what gave you images on a negative. Without getting into too technical a discussion, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the grain alone. I'm going to go ahead and hit the check mark button. And that, I think, is my finished image. If I hold down this button, or the picture, it shows me the original. And if I let go, that's my new version. And of course, I want to save, export. That saves a copy of it to my camera roll. And that, my friends, is how I use Snapseed to make my images really pop.